So I don't think we've had a discussion question for a couple of weeks, so I thought I'd bring one back in today. This is actually quite a tricky one, particularly given the context of what's going on in the world at the moment. So the question that I'd like you to discuss, maybe on two tables, is should Christians always be non-violent? So throughout history there's been a bit of a discussion about this, where some Christians would say that in some circumstances they should be involved in war, and others would say that they shouldn't be, that they should be, you know, conscientious objectors. Or I'm reading a novel at the moment actually set in the 1920s after the First World War, and that was really interesting, you know, how people viewed that at that time and that kind of mindset at that time. So I wonder if you can maybe split into two groups and maybe the back table go one way or the other, and just have a discussion of should Christians always be non-violent?
When things are going wrong, people look for a hero. When life is unjust, people look for someone to save them from the situation. We hear about it in news stories. Somebody came to the fore and was praised during a difficult time. At the other end of the spectrum, someone else was criticised and blamed when something bad happens. So often when things are going wrong, people look for someone to save them, for some kind of hero. They want to blame people for something that's going wrong or look for a hero to save them from that situation. In Jesus' earthly life, the bad guys were the Romans who were occupying Israel. The people wanted them gone so that they could be in control of their own country again. Different groups of Jews responded to this unfavourable situation in different ways. Some colluded with them to get what they could. Some withdrew from mainstream society altogether. Others thought that it was time that Israel was great again, wanting to get back to the glory of the time of King David. This group were willing to fight to achieve this. This group were the Zealots, and it seems that Barabbus, the prisoner freed as Jesus was condemned, was one of these. So there were three main responses by groups of Jews during Jesus' earthly lifetime to the Roman occupation. There was either this idea of withdrawing from society altogether, going and living outside of the cities and towns, living a pure life away from it all. There was either complete collusion and involvement with the Romans to get what, like Herod, who got his own power and his own favours and riches from working with the Romans, or there was this idea of taking up arms and fighting the Romans to try and get rid of them by force. So we think that Barabbas was probably one of the zealots, one of those who wanted to get rid of the Romans by force. This is the second message on resurrection characters, our series for Lent this year. We're looking at characters who were around Jesus in the lead up to his crucifixion and resurrection, and who we read about in the Gospels. Last time we looked at Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor in charge of Judea in Jesus' time. A crowd had gathered to see the prisoners, Jesus and Barabbas. Pilate gives them the opportunity to choose one to be freed as an act of amnesty at the time of Passover. They shout for Barabbas to be freed and for Jesus to be put to death. So in our last message in this series, we looked at the character of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor in charge. And so Jesus was sent to him by the Jewish leaders. They were asking for him to sentence Jesus to death. And we saw that he went along with that eventually, although he was saying that Jesus was innocent. He went along with that demand from both the Jewish leaders and the crowd to have Jesus put to death. But there was a choice there. There was a choice to have one prisoner freed at this particular time of year at the Passover. And the choice was between Barabbas, who was a convicted criminal guilty of murder in the insurrection, and Jesus, who had gone around speaking to people but hadn't committed any crime. But it's Jesus who is put to death and Barabbas who is freed. The crowd's choice is an interesting and a puzzling one. It seems that both men actually had the name Jesus, which was a common one at this time. The first part of Barabbas's name, Bar, also means son of the father. This is interesting, seeing as Jesus of Nazareth's relationship with his father is so significant. It is unclear exactly who made up this bloodthirsty crowd. Were these the same people who had welcomed Jesus the Messiah and waved palm leaves when he arrived in Jerusalem, but had subsequently had a complete change of heart? Were they servants of the Jewish leaders who had demanded that Pilate order Jesus of Nazareth's death? Or were they Barabbas' followers, desperate to see their hero freed? So people writing about this episode wonder who the crowd were. Were they the friendly crowd that had welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem that had suddenly turned nasty and gone against him? Were they the crowd who were supporting the Jewish leaders who had originally called for Jesus' death, and then the crowd backs them up? Or are they Barabbas' followers who want to go along with what he's doing and support him? Let's say, for argument's sake, they were fans of Barabbas. They wanted the hating Romans gone, and gone for good. They wanted a restoration of the glorious days when Israel was ruled by an Israelite king. What appeared on offer to them here? There was one person who had talked the talk of bringing in a new kingdom and of rebuilding the temple, but had only ended up getting arrested and hadn't even attempted to defend himself or fight back. Alternatively, their hero had fought for a free Israel, stopping at nothing, not even killing an enemy, to try to get it, and was here being given the chance to fight another day. They most likely believed that victory could one day be his and therefore theirs. So looking at it from the crowd's point of view, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus known as the Messiah, probably appeared to be weak and not offering them much promise. You know, people had had hope in his overthrowing the Romans when he talked of other kingdoms and when he talked about bringing change. But all they can see in him now is a convicted criminal who hasn't fought physically in any way at all. But when they look at Barabbas, they see a hero who is fighting, and if freed and released and kept alive, could continue fighting in the hope that he and others could get rid of the Romans. We could say that to this crowd, Barabbas was a nationalist to be admired. In their minds, he was a courageous Jew, a mighty warrior, a superhero of vengeance to be reckoned with. And if I just share my screen now to show some pictures. So if you can see this picture of the character of Barabbas in a film, we just get some idea of how he might have been imagined to be. Then we get this artist impression of Barabbas looking very strong, mighty and heroic there. Or we could even compare him to this other cartoon character who is a hero of vengeance, a hero of getting his own back on those who have worked against him and his, and getting revenge and right triumphing. By contrast, we see Jesus here in a picture in an artist impression of him, looking very gentle. And then we have another one by the same artist here of Jesus again looking very gentle. I particularly love that one. Compared to Jesus Barabbas, Jesus of Nazareth seems to the crowd meek, mild, ineffective and powerless. All their hopes of him overthrowing the Romans had been disappointed. All his talks of another kingdom had only led him to a shameful, humiliating death. It is possible that the disciple turned betrayer, Judas, was motivated by similar disappointment. This is how our Prince of Peace was viewed by them. So some scholars believe that it's possible that Judas's original motivation for handing Jesus over to be arrested was actually his disappointment that Jesus had not brought an army to overthrow the Romans. The crowd has a choice between a violent approach or a non-violent one, embodied in these two men named Jesus. They chose Barabbas, they chose violence. All this raises the question of how we respond to oppression and occupying armies today. This is so pertinent in what is going on in our world at the moment and was in similar situations throughout history. So looking back at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the book of Micah tells us to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. In both the Old and New Testaments, we read of a God who looks out for the widows, orphans, and other powerless groups in society. Yet we are still troubled by the times when we long for God to step in and protect the vulnerable and overthrow the oppressors, and he seems not to. In ancient times, the writer of Psalm 94 has asked these same questions. He cries out, "How long will the wicked, O Lord? How long will the wicked be jubilant?" He doesn't find any immediate response from God. So we particularly wonder at the moment, we're particularly seeking for God to come in and put things right. And we look around and we can't see an answer to the questions that we have. And this is not a new thing. And the Psalms really give voice to this with people that are looking for answers and not always finding them, and crying out to God that they want justice. They want the oppressors and people who are behaving in unkind ways to be put down, to be stopped. So although the psalmist doesn't find any immediate response from God, he ends up trusting the Lord, who has become my fortress, and my God, the rock in whom I seek refuge, he says. He is the God who avenges, the psalm reads, the judge of the earth. The psalmist will wait for his God to eventually put things right. It is God's job to judge and avenge, not his, he says. God is not against punishment, but desires it to be initiated by him, not by humans. So we have this wrestling that the psalmist has with things that are going wrong around him, but he puts his faith in God, that God will eventually put that right. And we're waiting and longing for a time when God comes to put things right as well. Jesus' teaching in the New Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount, tells us to turn the other cheek as a form of non-violent resistance. He also calls the peacemakers blessed. Now, this is a bit of a puzzling statement, but if we look at this in historical context, it might make a bit more sense. So apparently, when somebody would come to strike somebody they considered to be inferior to them, they wanted to put their hand up and strike them with the palm of their hand on their cheek. If somebody turned the other way, the person attacking was forced to either use the other side of their hand, which showed more respect, or to use a different hand entirely, which was the hands used for unpleasant things rather than for attacking. So it's a kind of resistance that forces the person attacking you to a position where they can't demean you in the same way. So it's not just a lying down and letting somebody trample all over you and just putting up with it. It's actually standing up to somebody in a way that is non-violent. And in a similar way, Jesus talks about, going the extra mile, which scholars think may refer to the fact that Roman soldiers were required to only walk a certain distance. So if they were forced to walk an additional distance, they would get into trouble. So that was another form of the oppressed standing up for themselves by not agreeing to what the Romans were doing. When we are faced with violent attacks, either on ourselves or on others, we may really struggle to follow Jesus's challenging instructions here. Yet this is what Jesus is telling his followers to do: to fight for justice and to stand up for the vulnerable, but by non-violent means. So this teaching to me is showing us that this is what he expects his followers to do. But obviously it's a very hard and challenging teaching to follow. Jesus the Messiah's death at first looks like the greatest of injustices. How can it be fair for a proven guilty murderer to be freed in the place of someone who has not broken any laws, who has healed rather than hurt? But Jesus of Nazareth made both the chief priest and the Romans uneasy and shook them on their power bases. They therefore sent him to his death. So another thing we've been looking at is different kinds of how power plays out between these characters in these narratives that lead up to Jesus's death. And so although Jesus was non-violent and didn't argue for himself, he was still felt as a threat to both the Jewish leaders and to the Romans because of the kind of things he was saying that threatened their power, or they felt threatened their power. When he was talking about another kingdom and a different kind of rule, that worried them. They didn't like that. The Zealot uprising eventually led to war with Rome, but the Romans crushed the rebellion and destroyed the temple. Violence and murder only begot more violence and murder. Barabbus was not victorious. So historically, this uprising amongst the Jewish people, they didn't win. The Romans put them down, and the Romans carried on ruling. So Barabbas and the other people who took that approach did not win a victory. Jesus of Nazareth's shameful death, on the other hand, led to the most unexpected victory, conquering sin and evil and bringing the eventual redemption of the whole universe. So although we're still waiting for that, what we celebrate at Easter is the victory of the cross. Difficult as it is for us to make sense of and follow, I think that Jesus' teaching on what to do when faced with a choice between violence and non-violence is clear. Give to God what is God's, vengeance is his. Give to God what is God's, vengeance is his.